in Eurasia program here at CSIS, and I have the distinct privilege and pleasure of moderating our discussion today with Noah Tucker, who is the senior editor for Radio Ozodlik, the Uzbek service for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I guess Noah's going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes, something like that.
I probably won't go that long.
Not even that long. And then we're going to open it up and just have a discussion. Very happy to see so many people come out for a talk about Uzbekistan. That's great. We were just commenting before the official part of the program started that all of the complaints and warnings that interest in Central Asia in this town was waning seem to be disproven by your presence here today. So thank you for that. And with that, please make sure all your noise-making electronic devices are set in such a way that they will not be making noise. And Noah.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you to everyone for being here today. Thanks to CSIS for having me. I'm still a little bit jet-lagged from Prague and headed back this evening, so if I space out or something in mid-sentence, then we'll attribute it to that. Wow, the room is getting fuller.
Yeah, so come on in and find a seat.
Well, I'm not going to speak too long on any particular prepared remarks, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, and I prefer in a way to speak directly to the things that are of interest to you. But to bring everyone up to speed a little bit, since Uzbekistan is not a topic on which we would assume that everyone is always up to speed at every moment, I can say I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you, or not news to any of you if you turned out for a talk today, that Uzbekistan has finally shown at least some sort of superficial signs of changing for the first time in over 25 years now, and I assume that's why many of you are here today, to discover what it is that might be happening. So you know, I'm sure that officially in September of last year, Uzbekistan's first and only president, Islam Karimov, died. As far as we know, he had probably been clinically dead, not only according to us, but to a surgeon who came at the request of his family and the government to examine him, that he had been clinically dead for some time before that, after suffering a severe brain hemorrhage. And for a period of almost 2 weeks then, from the time that he lost consciousness to the time that unexpectedly the country bypassed the constitutional process to name Shavkat Mirziyoyev, the prime minister, the new acting president, Uzbekistan had no leader, at least as far as anyone knew. And so it went from becoming one of the most notoriously closed countries in the world, run by the same authoritarian for over 25 years, to suddenly becoming a place that had no definite leader at all. And during that period, I think some of the signs that we saw from other states or from within the country tell us some things about what would develop after, or what the strategies, say, for Russia in particular were after that. In that short period before Mirziyoyev was officially named president, it became very clear on the Russian side that they had picked a dog in the fight, and that they were very enthusiastically backing Mirziyoyev behind some of the other candidates, not candidates exactly, it's not as if it were an election, but behind some of the others that many people who'd been asked, like myself, for years before this happened, to game plan. Of course, for years, there were all these questions. Would it be Gulnara? Would it be the daughter who succeeds him? Would it be Rustam Azimov? Would it be a pro-Western regime in some way, that way? And Mirziyoyev was always seen as the as I think generally the least likely of those in many of these think pieces, public and non-public, that I read in the years before the event finally happened. It's a good reminder, really, of just how opaque the whole system is, and how little we continue to know about what goes on inside of Uzbekistan. But one thing did become very clear in those few days, and that was that Russia was more or less 100% behind Mirziyoyev. And there have been persistent rumors through all of these months that ethnic Uzbek oligarchs who are closely tied to the Putin regime in Russia would be moving back to Uzbekistan or accepting citizenship in Uzbekistan. Alisher Usmanov, the most wealthy and famous of the great Gazprom oligarchs, and I think owner of one of the UK soccer teams, if I'm not mistaken. There were rumors that his plane was flying back and forth and all of these things, and after he had managed to evade taxes in any country for many years. He even gave an interview in which he said if he became a tax resident of any country, it would certainly be Uzbekistan. And all of this has kind of come to a head now in this last week as President Mirziyoyev made his first official state visit to a country outside of Central Asia. He's been to Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan already, but he was in Russia this last week and signed significant investment agreements with Russian companies that are controlled mostly by several of these ethnic Uzbek oligarchs who have shown a willingness to put some sort of money back into the country. The case for Mirziyoyev as a reformer is sort of undermined by this closeness to Russia and by the affinity that the Putin administration in particular shows for him. But things to the positive end of that case were steps that he took while he was still theoretically running for the presidency. Of course, he ran against candidates who had already been defeated handily by former President Karimov before. So he ran on this idea that he was accepting the mantle of Karimov. And in the early days, he said he wasn't going to change anything that Karimov had done because obviously it was all wonderful. But the most significant change probably that we've seen from Mirziyoyev is a shift in tone, more than a shift in policy. He has signaled in different ways to the people of Uzbekistan that for the first time in many years, they get to acknowledge that not everything in their lives is absolutely perfect, that they get to actually complain about things. And this is a really significant change in tone, if not in actual style or action of the government. He set up what he called a virtual complaint box that was supposed to be run out of the Prime Minister's office. And then this project met with so much public enthusiasm. The Prime Minister's office virtual complaint box received over 300,000, I think up to 400,000 complaints from citizens by the election in December, that he ordered all of the other ministries to set up their own complaint boxes. And then he ordered local governors and local mayors to set up time during their day, at least once a week, where they would receive citizens from the community that they governed in order to get complaints for them. And it got to the point where it grew out of hand in the perspective of many of the people serving in local government. Last week, we heard, we received complaints from a number of people from one particular rural village who had heard that Mirziyoyev was going to be visiting a town nearby. And this group of elderly pensioners got together and boarded a bus that was supposed to take them to the city where they were planning to meet with the president and complain to him in person about things that were happening. And according to them, The local mayor ordered the police force to go out and barricade the road and stop the bus from going to reach Mirziyoyev. We don't know for sure. We had multiple sources who said that this happened, and of course the mayor's office wouldn't comment and denied it, and the local police wouldn't comment on it. But this is the sort of story that we're beginning to hear over and over again from inside Uzbekistan. Now, I have something to complain about, and I'm going to bring it to Mirziyoyev myself. It's a reminder for everyone familiar with Russian imperial history of that old adage, if the Tsar only knew. If there was a way that I could somehow get to the Tsar and I could just bring him my complaint, he would rout these villains who are robbing the local population and things like that, and all the evildoers would be punished and justice would be upheld. And that's the sort of story that seems to prevail in Uzbekistan now. There have been no real significant changes in the way that the government approaches things. There's some economic development going on, particularly in the capital, Tashkent, for the first time in many years. They're negotiating a renewed relationship with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There's some new external investment that's coming in from Russia. And so there's a slight thaw on things like that. But in terms of actual changes for political freedom or freedom of speech, we hear a lot of promises about how everything is different now than it used to be from the government, but very little action from local media, or very few changes when it comes to actual freedom of speech. People aren't holding protests freely. Our journalists are still not accredited. Our stringers remain, we still don't have a bureau in the country. We've not been invited to come back. Our stringers risk arrest and persecution every time they accept an assignment and go out and try to report a story. Anyone who talks to us over secure messaging or over email or however they choose to get to us, if we publish something on it, oftentimes they're pressured, there's a backlash against them, they're threatened with arrest, they're threatened by the police, and then after it begins to draw national attention, then usually the local authorities promise to solve all of their problems if they just will please shut up and stop talking to the outside world. There's a really moving story that we did about a month ago with one of our journalists in Tashkent, who is a remarkable and widely recognized photographer and videographer. I won't say her name because she reports anonymously for us, but if you're familiar with Uzbekistan and its art scene, you know who this photographer is, because she's quite well respected. And she went out on her own volition to shoot the story of a young single mother, a girl who's in her early 20s, who had gotten married to a guy who left her as soon as she became pregnant. And she is now, the rest of her family has died. She was left an orphan earlier in life. And her grandmother, who she had lived with and in whose house she'd lived for years since her parents died, had died just recently. And our photographer found her living in squalid conditions with a tiny infant. And she talked freely on camera about how in a village about an hour and a half or 2 hours outside of Tashkent, the big gleaming capital city, she doesn't even have natural gas on a regular basis so that she could cook. She doesn't have electricity so that she can cook. She showed not even because she can't pay her bills, but because in this village, the electrical utility and the gas utility just do not deliver on the services that they're supposed to bring. And she shows on the video this tiny little single electric burner that she uses to prepare hot food for herself and her baby. And she said the electricity shuts off so often that it takes her 6 hours just to make a bowl of porridge for her little infant daughter. And she is supposed to be getting government benefits to help her take care of her daughter and health care. Uzbekistan, of course, theoretically has universal national health care for all of its residents, but she's not able to get any of these things because they won't process her paperwork. And when we showed this video, the response from Uzbeks living around the world was just overwhelming. Actually, we had to try to coordinate with the embassy to find a way that we could safely coordinate all of the people who wanted to help her after seeing this heartbreaking story. So that was the public response, and as it built and built over 24 hours or so, particularly on social media, the local authorities found out about it, and the police came to this girl's home and banged on her door and threatened her and said that if she continues to talk to us or talk to the outside world, then they're going to make her life even more difficult than it already was. And our journalists who worked on it, particularly Sirajuddin Talibov, who's a wonderful journalist who's been covering Uzbekistan for 25 years already, he spent a lot of time on his weekend using his phone registry to call everyone in the local government in this village and the offices above them to complain about this and threaten that we were going to publicize it further if they harmed a hair on this girl's head. And at that point, the local police were rebuked by their superiors and forced to back off. And the government promised to organize a commission and take care of all of her problems and things like that. But a day or so later, someone closely affiliated with the very closely government-affiliated Muftiate in Uzbekistan began spreading stories on social media that this young woman whose story we covered was a prostitute and that no one should help her because she's a prostitute, that her baby should starve, essentially, because she's a prostitute. This was terribly offensive to a lot of actual Uzbekistani Muslims who pointed out to him with arguments from scripture about why there is nothing in Islam that says that a child has to starve if their mother was a prostitute, and rebuking him over social media. And the next day, one of the government-affiliated media outlets ran a story with anonymous sources saying that the entire thing was a scam and that she was actually living comfortably and that she had taken advantage of us and that she was collecting all of this money from abroad now on false premises. And we had to, again, contact the editors for this media outlet and demand to know who their sources were for this story because we had vetted it very carefully before we ran it. And they, to their credit, they had to admit that their source had never been to this village and didn't know the girl at all and had no access to this information. So in other words, it was someone from the SNB who had called them and told them to run this story. And they, to their credit, retracted it at the time that we challenged them. That's a slight change. You know, those are the sort of things that I could say are even somewhat hopeful, because 2 years ago, when something like that happened, as it did on a regular basis, the outlet wouldn't have retracted the story. You know, they didn't publish a correction or anything like that, but just the fact that they took it down was a somewhat hopeful change. So I guess the moral of the story, to bring it to a close, is that we can see through many different anecdotal events like this one that the system itself has not really changed. The face, the name, and the title of the president has changed. And I think maybe some of the intentions have genuinely changed. But the system that was constructed over so many years is bigger than a single person. It was far bigger than Islam Karimov, and no matter how much influence and power we might have imagined he wielded, really what happens in systems like this, as we see all over the world in analogous countries, is that there is a tyrant, as we like to imagine in a sort of comforting way, who sits at the top. And we imagine that when he finally dies, or when he's finally removed, somehow that everything will change. But the reality is, and I think this has now been proven 6 to 7 months into what we might have called a transition, that there is no transition. It was Karimov's Uzbekistan was not just the office of the presidency. Karimov's Uzbekistan was one of the most highly consolidated authoritarian regimes in the world, and continues to be such. And unfortunately, one of the other things that we've seen, particularly in the past few months, pop up over and over again are people who had fled Uzbekistan a lot of times in their youth because they were not able, for a variety of reasons, I guess we'll say. They left the country and then became recruited into or enamored with Islamist extremist organizations, and now in this year, for the first time, with alarming frequency, we see some of these natives of Uzbekistan and Uzbeks native to the region engaging in attacks inspired or directed by these groups based in Syria or Pakistan, and attacking civilians in the countries where they live outside of the region. The terrible January 1st attack in Istanbul was by an Uzbek named Masharipov, who lived in the Fergana Valley many years ago, but left and was influenced deeply by the situation in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then eventually in Turkey. And he was convinced by his handlers in the Islamic State he was handed an AK-47 and walked into a nightclub where he believed there wouldn't be other Muslims because it was, according to him in subsequent testimony, because this was a secular holiday. It was a Christian holiday, it's January 1st. Only, I sort of laugh about this in a terrible way, because only someone from Central Asia, from the former Soviet Union, would believe that January 1st is a Christian holiday, since this was where Christmas was sort of moved over in the Soviet period. And then it turned out that most of the people who he murdered in cold blood at this nightclub were tourists from the Middle East, from Arab majority countries. And this was deflating to many of the people on social media, the very, very small minority of people who passively support these groups, and was horrifying to everyone else, to all other Uzbeks watching this, and has caused the lives of the thousands, tens of thousands of Uzbek migrants who live and work in Turkey to become much more difficult. And then just in the last week, we had attacks in the St. Petersburg metro and the truck attack in Stockholm that have both been attributed to ethnic Uzbeks who've been pulled into these groups. And so the problems that originate in the region, in Uzbekistan and southern Kyrgyzstan, do radiate into the rest of the world and are having effects far beyond the borders of these very close countries. So it's something to take seriously, but I doubt I have to convince any of you of that, since you're here. So thank you for indulging me this, and I'll be happy to take your questions and do my best to answer.
Okay, Noah, thank you so much for that overview. That was really comprehensive and interesting. I wanted to ask you, before we kick it out to the audience, just about one of the other areas where at least a lot of the press coverage here has emphasized the ways in which things have changed since the transition in Uzbekistan, and that is in relations with the neighbors. Saw just yesterday or today, actually, that Uzbekistan Airlines flew their first flight in 25 years to Dushanbe.
Yeah.
Heard that there's been progress on things like border demarcation with Kyrgyzstan. And this all seems to have been moving pretty quickly. So what's the sense that you get from people that you're talking with on the ground in Uzbekistan about what's behind this push to improve ties with the neighbors and how far it might go?
Well, this has been, this is one area that I neglected to mention in the talk, but we can say that we've seen some sort of genuine reform or genuine change, particularly with relations to Tajikistan and with Kyrgyzstan as well. The border demarcation has been frozen for many, many years. It's finally beginning to move forward. That is an area where we see some genuine change. And it's been greeted with a lot of enthusiasm by the public in both countries, especially people who live in the border communities. And this is in a way not so much a reform as it is an undoing of deeply irrational policies that were based mostly on the sort of personal peccadillos of the previous leader rather than any sort of rational economic or security strategy on the part of Uzbekistan. And so we do see changes in things like this where, because we have a different personality in power who may later turn out to have his own peccadillos or his own particular grudges or interests, because he's not limited or influenced by those in the way that Karimov was, who had a notoriously noxious relationship with President Rahmon in Tajikistan. He's able to pursue what is, in fact, a more logical or rational policy with his neighbors than his predecessor was. And it's something, I don't want to. We try to be careful in our coverage in particular, and I, as the editor in particular, try to be careful that we don't. We became so used to criticizing Karimov for a long time and to criticizing Uzbekistan that I don't ever want to miss the chance to recognize positive reform when it happens, because I worry, especially for us as a media outlet with a large following inside the country, that if we fail to recognize positive reforms, then the government may not see what the point is in making them if they're just going to be criticized anyway. So I do want to, I'm glad that you asked that and that we have the opportunity to note that I think that is a positive reform, but one that doesn't necessarily indicate a systemic change or change in direction.
Okay, at this point, I think we should just open it up to questions. We have microphones in the back, so please wait for that. When you're identified, please state your name and please keep it brief and ask a question, which is something that isn't a question mark. So, yes. Up front here.
Thank you. Rohul Osmani. I'm a visiting scholar with Johns Hopkins CSIS. You discussed the internal issues with regards to the change of government. My question is, what is the regional impact of these changes in Uzbekistan? How much this change will bring opportunities for Uzbekistan to be a positive player into the regional integration, especially working with neighbors in terms of economic cooperation around the region? How do you see that from your experience of visiting there?
Well, I don't expect to see, or I haven't seen any indications, genuine indications from Mirziyoyev or actually any of his counterparts in the region that they want to commit themselves to forming any sort of actual region in a meaningful way. I mean, they continue to relate to one another on a bilateral basis, and any sort of regional integration project, like a Central Asian Economic Community or a free tariff zone or something like that, would sort of be torpedoed by the fact that several of the larger economies in the region have already committed to the Eurasian Economic Zone and would certainly need permission from Russia or actually just the other members of the Eurasian Economic Zone, of the customs union, to extend any sort of special customs privileges to any of their other neighbors. Security cooperation also, I would expect to see Russia work very hard to undo, since Russia already has a security organization, CSTO, that it wants very much for Uzbekistan to rejoin. Russia, the biggest player and the biggest economy in the region, very much wants regional integration, but it wants regional integration of the whole former Soviet Union as best as it can reconstruct it. Any kind of integration projects for a sub-region like Central Asia, as we saw in like the Baltics, for example, I think would be viewed very negatively by Russia, and they certainly have strong levers of influence that they can use in order to interfere with whatever plans the Central Asian states might have. But I don't think that they, Kazakhstan, for example, the largest economy in the region by far, has already integrated. It was one of the initiators of the Eurasian Economic Community. So I don't expect them to see to push for anything other than sort of improved bilateral relationships that way.
And has there been any discussion about Uzbekistan rejoining the CSTO or joining the Eurasian?
There's a great deal of discussion on the Russian side, and
as there always is,
and in the Russian media. Mirziyoyev has been very careful to be non-committal about it. And I don't, so far, while Russia has some other levers that they could use to try to manipulate Uzbekistan, in particular, the over 1 million migrant laborers that are residents in Russia and send back a large percentage of the Uzbek GDP, as in Tajikistan, just a smaller percentage. Russia hasn't shown any need so far to hold out a stick. They're continuing to work with the carrot approach.
Okay. Yeah.
Odil Rozali, VOA Uzbek. You're saying that there are no changes in Uzbekistan, systemic changes. Do you think that there is no intention on the part of Mirziyoyev for those changes, or there is a resistance in the elite to those changes? And if so, could you tell us who are those people in the elite, and what do you see happening, developing between Mirziyoyev and these people in the future?
I don't know that Mirziyoyev has any real incentive to be a large-scale reformer, to change the system or tinker with it too much. I mean, we do see some indications, as I'm sure you're aware, and many others in the room are. There's another, aside from the presidency, the security services run for a very long time by Iniyatov are viewed as the other large center of power inside the country. And actually, I've argued at different times over the years that the security services may be a more important center of power than the presidency, because they exert so much control over staffing of the government at all levels, and are able to also, in a way that a similar system developed in Russia as the SNB and former SNB folks around and allied with Putin in the mid and late 1990s accumulated increasing amounts of power in Russia, based by some accounts over information that they controlled and access to things that they controlled. I think the SNB works in a very similar way in Uzbekistan, where they have a tremendous amount of material that they've gathered on anyone important in the government, who, if they were to try to cross them too sharply or cross their interests too sharply, they could easily ruin the public image of just about anyone in power. And this is a process that we see happen over and over again in Uzbekistan, where no politician, aside from just a few at sort of the very top, are actually safe. Mayors of Tashkent have been replaced over and over again and sentenced to long terms in prison that are usually turned into house arrest based on just tremendous corruption that gets revealed. And the system is itself so inherently corrupt that I think it's very safe to understand that anyone who's anyone in power is connected to very corrupt schemes, and once those are exposed, they're subject to prosecution if they lose, if they cross the wrong person, or if they fall out of the circle. And that's a tool that the state security organs in particular can use to guard their own power. We see very small, sort of incremental beginnings of change potentially, where Mirziyoyev may be cutting out some of the lower to mid-level people in Tashkent city government, especially who are viewed as clients of Iniyatov. So a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, basically the entire Yunusobod district government, which is one of the largest and wealthiest districts in Tashkent, was fired and are expected to come under corruption charges again. And our local sources tell us that all of these people were connected to a prosecutor who's viewed as a kind of protege and close ally of Iniyatov, the head of the security services. So I think I would expect what we'll see over the next year or two are small attempts like that by Mirziyoyev and his allies to begin to try to undermine the power of other serious power brokers. And eventually they'll probably push back in some way. So we'll just see.
Okay, yeah.
Rafi from American University. So we just recently heard that Stockholm suspect was from Uzbekistan, and we also know that hundreds, maybe not thousands, of Uzbeks are fighting in Middle East. It's the wrong side. So the question is that what would be state policy in that direction in fighting these extremist movements after Karimov in Uzbekistan?
State policy in Uzbekistan? The policy hasn't changed. That's one area. Another area where there was a great deal of hope that there might be some sort of loosening, particularly on people who are just religious, that they might have some degree of increased freedom of speech, or that some of the we don't even know, 10 to 11,000 prisoners of conscience who are held usually on charges of just being religious might be released or paroled. There were some rumors around things like that large numbers of political prisoners might be freed in the amnesty that happened in December, and then it didn't happen. So Uzbekistan's approach to countering to countering terrorism and countering extremist groups is just to arrest anything that moves. Anyone who has a beard, anyone who goes to mosque a little bit too often, anyone of any religion who meets in their home to discuss religious things. I wrote an article a couple of years ago about a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, in Tashkent, who was with a group of people, was arrested in the home of a friend, tried to flee the police, hide in the closet in the back of the house, and was dragged out, arrested and fined, and had to flee the country. And this seems like we all assume when we hear this story, because we've heard it so many times, well, they must have been Muslims having a secret Quran study or something. My friend is an ethnic Korean Protestant Christian who was meeting with other Koreans having a Bible study and hot dogs or something in an apartment of a friend, and they were all arrested and charged with having an unregistered with participating in unregistered religious activity, and this is the Uzbek government's approach to combating terrorism. The idea is if you just make a hammer that's big enough and you just swing it hard enough, then probably you'll smash all the terrorists, and it doesn't matter how many other people you catch up along the way. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that we don't have, before I came to RFE, I worked primarily on extremism and terrorist recruiting for a number of years. And I haven't seen a case in many, many years, a credible case of anyone being even recruited inside Uzbekistan. I mean, they don't bother even trying. The country is locked down so tightly, and the economy is struggling, and anyone who has any interest in religion knows, for the most part, that unless they want to be content with learning over and over again to do ablutions in the government-run mosques, or to be told that if they don't pick enough cotton that they might go to hell, then they need to leave the country. And so there are hundreds of thousands of Uzbekistanis who have left the country and tried to make their way elsewhere. And that's often where they become where they're really actively targeted by these extremist groups. They still have very low success rates. I mean, the per capita number of citizens of Uzbekistani origin who joined militant groups in Syria was minuscule compared to, say, the infant mortality rate in Uzbekistan. So, in terms of a larger scale problem, it just is not one. But it's a really serious human problem especially for people living in communities like St. Petersburg, where when one person is pulled into one of these groups and commits a terrible act, then hundreds of thousands of others suffer because of the increased tension and increased police attention in a country where they're already treated quite badly by the authorities and by the local population. And so it has the potential to become a vicious circle, whereas people become more and more desperate, they also become more vulnerable to being recruited to a group that promises to provide them with meaning and power and to take care of their needs. So it's an unfortunate problem, and I think it's extra unfortunate that the approach taken by Uzbekistan to solve that problem works out to probably be counterproductive. And if not counterproductive, it seems to do very little to solve the problem because it's approaching it in the wrong way.
Okay, yeah.
Alex Meligishvili, IHS Market. Thank you for your comments. I have a question about the most recent outreach by President Mirziyoyev to the businessmen in Russia of Uzbek origin. This was a very important part of his recent visit to Moscow. And in this regard, I'd like to note that he drastically differs from his predecessor.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you can comment on that. And in particular, do you see this approach actually working in terms of Uzbek businessmen? There are quite a few with vast sums of money actually going back to Uzbekistan and investing in different projects. Thanks very much.
Well, we don't, although there have been some promises and a lot of kind words spoken, we don't know to what extent any of these that he reached out to in Moscow and St. Petersburg would actually return to the country in some active way, although there's a lot of rumors around this. But he does see, I mean, I appreciate what you note, because this is a very different approach than his predecessor, who made it clear that these people were not welcome in the country. And actually, when our reporter reached out to people around Usmanov to comment on this, and ask the question, you know, why now? Why not before? And the source, which is anonymous for these purposes, said very clearly he knew he was not welcome. Like, Karimov didn't want his money, and he knew that. So that is a different approach, and I think it may, in terms of the economic experience or economic potential for people living inside Uzbekistan, particularly in the capital, where a lot of this investment is going, we might see some genuine improvements in quality of life. I mean, one of the more ramshackle sections of Tashkent, Sergeli, is being renovated in a massive construction project where they're putting in buildings that will house hundreds of apartments. And there is Tashkent, like a lot of its other capital cities in its counterpart capital cities in Central Asia, is a swollen city that's overcrowded in spite of the very strict regulations where you have to get the government's approval in order to live there. That notwithstanding, many people have brought their families from the countryside, or extended families from other parts, because the economy simply, though it's not good in Uzbekistan in general, is doing much better in Tashkent than in other areas. So we talk to, our reporters talk to a lot of people inside Tashkent, especially in older areas where they're living in small traditional homes. Sometimes, I don't remember what the exact square meter to square feet equivalent was, but we're talking about a small 2-room house that holds 10 or 15 people in an immediate family. And real estate is quite expensive in Tashkent because of the demand. And this housing program is meant to give very preferential terms for loans, so that these families who are living in really cramped conditions can buy one of these new apartments that's going up. And it is a big question if the government is having trouble raising money itself, which Mirziyoyev has himself acknowledged for the first time in a very long time, that Uzbekistan's budget numbers are not as rosy as what they're given on paper. Where are they getting the money to do this very large-scale construction project and then extend the metro line as well out to these new housing projects? And the answer, from what we've heard, although we can't confirm 100%, is that a wealthy ethnic Uzbek oligarch in Kazakhstan struck some sort of deal to fund this real estate development, and it's going up very quickly. So that is a change, and one that I guess we would say is positive. We'll sort of see what comes of it, but it may definitely help improve the quality of living for citizens in Tashkent.
Okay, up here.
Hi, thank you, very enlightening. My name is Mindy Reiser. I've worked in this part of the world. Concomitant with the encouragement of investment, I'm assuming that people would need new skills and new areas of intellectual and technical exploration. So are there any initiatives in terms of the education infrastructure in the country, higher education, post-secondary education, technical education?
Not so far. There were promises that things like this would happen during the campaign period, and there is what looks like might be first on Mirziyoyev's agenda in a lot of different sectors is making at least a public gesture toward combating corruption. They've done this. He did it initially with the road police. So Uzbekistan, like a lot of former Soviet countries, has a separate police division that enforces rules of the road. And in Uzbekistan, as in many other places, they make their own laws. They flag drivers over and insist that they've committed some kind of crime, and then offer to take a bribe for slightly less. And they make a great deal of money, and then they funnel up to the top. And when it was interesting, when he opened up this virtual complaint box, a huge portion of the complaints were about the traffic police who were preying on people. And so one of the first things that he did once he was elected president was hold a big meeting. Mirziyoyev was the prime minister who was responsible for many, many years for Uzbekistan's cotton production. And he used to have these infamous meetings called selectors, where he brings together all of the regional hakims who are in charge of fulfilling their cotton quotas, sometimes very late at night or super early in the morning, and he'll gather them all in a room and yell and scream and swear at them, and sometimes, according to many stories that we can't confirm but have heard, would even physically abuse them for not meeting their cotton quotas. And he has, actually to much public applause, brought this same approach to a lot of the other areas of government that he now oversees. He has now these actually quite popular televised selector meetings with different branches of government, where he brings them all together, and this is all aired on national television like a sort of blood sport for everyone to watch, where he sits and he dresses down these, I won't say pores, they're quite notoriously corrupt officials who aren't particularly good at their job many times, and he yells at them and dresses them down and swears at them on television and all of this, switching back and forth in languages depending on what he feels like or what they speak at the moment. And he's gotten through the police and healthcare already, and there are some indications that education will be the next sector that he brings his personal approach to. But we don't have, education is another sector that's notoriously corrupt, and that creates all sorts of problems far down the line, because if anyone can just pay a certain amount of money to the medical school admissions board and then to the medical school certification board to be certified as a medical doctor, which has long been the case in Uzbekistan, then it creates all sorts of problems, broader social problems, where you have people who just are not properly trained, even, who didn't go through the instruction that did exist to do very specialized jobs in some cases. Of course, there are many students who are very dedicated and who are hardworking and go to their courses and fulfill their requirements, but the incentives are not very high to be a good student if you have any means, because you can get the same grades or better grades by paying your teachers than you can by actually working hard. And so this is universally recognized as a serious social problem, but one that they haven't been able to agree about how to solve. And so we may see them try to approach that before they take a bigger step, like really re-inviting other international organizations or educational institutions to set up partnership programs and things again inside Uzbekistan, like what we had before 2005, when relations really tanked with a lot of the rest of the world. There is some hope for that, and even in the late years of the Karimov period, friends at State Department tell me that they were becoming more and more open to try to getting English courses taught again and things like that, and getting some support and potentially funding from the U.S. State Department to revitalize some of that they destroyed themselves after the Andijan fallout, because they realized that good English language skills or some foreign language skills are critical for interacting in the foreign economy, in the world economy, and in meeting global standards for education.
Yep.
Mitchell Pullman, continuing with the economic thread, we all know Uzbekistan is heavily dependent on cotton. I'm wondering what, if anything, is being done to, shall we say, wean the country off cotton and to diversify, and if there's a serious effort to get rid of child labor.
Well, again, to give credit sort of where credit is due, they did, in fact, make a serious effort to cut down on child labor already in the late Karimov period. They were pressured very hard to meet their commitments in these things, and they did it pretty successfully. Not 100%, but you get in a lot of trouble if you're caught using child labor in Uzbekistan, if a local official is caught. But they did it not by abandoning forced labor or by treating farmers better or something like that. They did it by meeting the technical demands of the law without necessarily fulfilling the spirit of the law. So according to the international conventions to which they're subject, it's not child labor if the child is 15. and so what we saw happen was university students, and Uzbekistan has a system where after the 9th grade you enroll in a college, a lyceum or a college. So 14 and 15-year-old students go to sort of an advanced high school to prepare them for technical fields or for university. And those institutions became the subject of like universal mobilization, where and all students age 15 and older were sent out, but that was not enough to replace what they had before. And so we see universal mobilization of anyone who technically works for the government, which means it means all school teachers, it means all healthcare professionals, actually. Or we had an awful story last fall, I think it was in late September or early October, where a family in the rural western part of the country was due to have a baby, and the wife went into labor, and they rushed her to the maternity hospital, and there were no doctors there because they had all been sent out to pick cotton. And the nurses did the best they could to try to deliver the baby, but there were complications, and the infant died after living for about 24 hours. And we reached out when the distraught family called us because they just wanted this known. They wanted it not to be for nothing. They wanted this to go out to the public. And when our reporter reached out to the head doctor at the hospital and to the head of the healthcare for the region, they were both still in the field picking cotton themselves. And so when they discovered who they were talking to, they wanted to try to deny, but they admitted that all the staff for the hospital was out in the field with them. So it sometimes has other unforeseen consequences because, as you said, the economy is still heavily dependent on cotton, and even not just the economy itself, but the economy, the top parts of the economy that particularly are controlled by the government elites are particularly dependent on the cotton harvest, especially for foreign currency influx, which is always a shortage in Uzbekistan. And so they do everything they can to try to follow the letter of the agreements on child labor and at the same time continue to force people to mobilize.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Badamdash Ramsfeld Fellow from Mongolia. My question regards more regional issue. Have there been any initiatives or efforts from the regional countries to build regional integration without not necessarily involving Russian sponsorship or initiative? Second question is, China has been interested in more involvement in the region through their project called One Belt and Road Initiative. Have there been any substantial cooperation between China and the region or Uzbekistan?
There is significant cooperation with China in natural gas export. Uzbekistan built it. Now, I have to say too, I felt pretty good that I'd gotten through all of the questions without getting to one that really is outside my area. But when we get to natural gas and oil and things, I have to confess we are getting outside of the area that I look at. But there is the Turkmenistan-China pipeline that was built several years ago. They added, of course, an Uzbekistan subline and a large amount of Uzbekistani natural gas now goes to China through that subsidiary line, and that's remarkable in many ways because it's very unpopular in Uzbekistan because the increase in export to China exceeded the amount that Uzbekistan could actually export and continue to meet domestic needs. And so circling back to the story of the young single mother with a baby who has to spend 6 hours to boil a pot of porridge, that's related in some ways directly to that deal because there just is not enough gas left in the rural regions in Uzbekistan to meet the commitments that they've made for export to China and meet domestic demand. And they were fairly upfront about that at the time that the deal went through. And the government's decision was to encourage very strongly everyone to install wood, coal, and dung-burning furnaces in their residencies rather than depend on natural gas for heat, as they had through the whole Soviet period, or for heating their stoves and cooking. Since in the time that Mirziyoyev has become president, in this limited time, I mean, he's sent signals, of course, that he wants to increase Chinese cooperation, that he won't link solely to Russia, that he wants to continue Karimov's multilateral foreign policy. But the only real concrete progress and real concrete efforts that have been made so far are toward partners in the region bilaterally, and then of course to Russia now. So we don't, I think, know yet what Mirziyoyev's policy toward China will be and how much he may be aware of these programs or take advantage of them. One of the reasons why Mirziyoyev was never tapped as a favorite to replace Karimov was because he had, through his whole career, been deeply involved in domestic policy and in the agricultural economy, almost unilaterally involved in the agricultural economy. Nobody knew how to run the cotton sector better than Shavkat Mirziyoyev. But many of those who opposed him, and even many international observers, pointed out the fact that he doesn't have any foreign policy experience at all. And he doesn't speak any foreign languages other than Russian, and doesn't have much foreign travel experience even, and he would be seen as maybe a strong candidate for running things domestically with a strong fist, which doesn't mean something bad in Uzbek, especially in Uzbekistan, but that he probably would be naive for some time when it came to foreign policy, especially trying to negotiate things with larger partners like China or potentially the United States. So Russia is sort of the easy route for him.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. I think we've got 3 up here. Why don't we take all 3 of those and then we can wrap it up.
Atabek Halilov. One of the other factors that hinders the economy of Uzbekistan in a major way is the currency exchange rates. The fact that there exists a black market currency exchange, which is almost double of the acknowledged national currency exchange rate. What do you think are the factors that cause there to be such a discrepancy in the need for a black market in the first place, and what efforts are being taken at the moment to do away with this hindrance?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad someone got to that, because that was one of the issues that during the campaign people brought up over and over again, and in the first months of Mirziyoyev's presidency. This is one of the other issues that even through the complaint box in particular, there was tremendous public demand. That, it was one of the interesting things about the complaint box is that we got to see for the first time, because people felt permission to speak about problems, that we get to hear directly from them what are the problems they feel affect their lives. And a huge percentage of the complaints, especially in meetings or forums that were held with businessmen and entrepreneurs in Tashkent, were about exactly this issue. We had in late September or early October, they held what was supposed to be a closed meeting with about 4,000 entrepreneurs in a large theater in Tashkent. And people were told to write down their questions and send them to these government officials who were sitting on a stage in front. They refused to do that. They demanded a microphone, and they demanded to speak to the government officials. And over, people came up to the microphone and said, the currency exchange rate is killing us, and forcing people to move their transactions onto plastic debit cards, which were supposed to somehow allay the problems with currency shortages and currency exchanges, have also created other serious economic obstacles, because the banks and merchants charge people up to 20% fees to take money off of these cards once their money has gone on to them. And so these two problems, which are connected as far as we can tell, are these kind of boulders that the new government is carrying around on their back, especially in terms of what the public has already said that they want. And so every time Mirziyoyev makes some sort of economic address or issues some sort of economic decree, there are a large number of people who read into that a promise to deal with the currency conversion problem. He issued in December one of these things that he calls a draft decree. He's done a number of these that sort of promise reforms, outline a map for things that are supposed to be reformed, but don't necessarily say how they will be or when they will be or what the timetable are. And then these draft decrees are circulated among all of the government agencies, and they're all supposed to comment on them and submit their suggestions about how the changes will be implemented. And already back within a week or two after he was elected and sworn in, he issued an economic policy draft decree that stated currency exchange is a problem, we recognize it's a problem, and this is something that we have to solve. And people got very excited. They thought that this meant that the government was going to act on this, especially as the black market exchange rate, the value of the SUM continues to fall to record lows, almost on a monthly basis at this point. It's fallen about 40%, I think, in the last 12 months, while the official exchange rate doesn't remotely keep up.
What's driving the exchange rate down?
Probably the same factors that are driving it down in the rest of the region, that drive the ruble lower, that have driven the Kyrgyz SUM lower, the Kazakh SUM once it was floated. We don't know for sure, but it probably has to do to after effects to those things. It's just the black market exchange rate shows the actual market value, and so Uzbekistan is not immune to the factors that are affecting all of its neighbors. But there has been tremendous resistance to implementing this reform from other agencies of the government. And according to sources that we have in the central bank in Uzbekistan, the reason for this, you'll hear this from many other sources as well, is that people, particularly within the security services, have deals with foreign businesses that benefit tremendously by being able to pay out rates at controlled levels that are much lower than the true value of the Uzbek sum. And then there's also a huge industry of black market currency exchange that's not regulated by other portions of the government. And many sources say, although we cannot prove, that the black market currency exchange is controlled by former finance minister Rustam Azimov and the head of the SNB, Iniatov, and his allies. And they are, this is a golden goose for them, and they are, at least it seems, powerful enough at this point, up to this point, to protect their own interests in spite of the huge public pressure to make changes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Nilufar Kabulova, and thank you very much for your detailed and insightful comments, which were very valuable, but at the same time killed the very little hope that we had remaining, I have to confess. And to kind of, I guess, end this at a positive note, I would like to ask you this question. If you were to do a SWOT analysis on Uzbekistan, like, I mean, we've heard enough about weaknesses and threats, what would you highlight as strengths and opportunities of the country, like, potentially? Thank you.
Well, I think that's sort of an easy one to answer for me. Uzbekistan's tremendous strength is in its people, especially its young people. It has, like many of the other countries in the region, it has a demographic youth bubble. And for as many hindrances as there have been for youth to develop themselves and get the kind of education that that they should be able to get in their own country, Uzbekistani youth are a tremendously talented and resourceful and determined group of people. And I think that it's my feeling, it has been my feeling for a long time, that sooner or later, while there won't be systemic change in the country, as long as the Soviet generation is still in charge, once the Soviet generation, which includes Mirziyoyev, is finally, by time, which is merciless to all of us, when enough time passes that Soviet generation oligarchs who have created this system to benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else are pushed out, if by nothing else than death, like Karimov, I have every reason to believe that the younger generation, people my age and our age and younger, don't desire to replicate the same system. That once Mirziyoyev or whoever follows him is replaced by this very big demographic swell that outnumber their elders by almost 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 in Uzbekistan. Once people of the independence generation are able to run their own country, finally, instead of be governed by these people trained in the Soviet legacy, that many of these changes will finally happen. Or will be forced to happen, whether or not there's true democratic reform or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's, with all of these post-Soviet countries, I think we sometimes forget how much of the legacy of the Soviet Union is still very much alive with the people who are in charge. And when they're no longer in charge, it'll be a very different country. But the interesting question is, in what ways will it be different?
Yeah, I mean, we can't say for sure. I mean, the elites that know they are on their way out are doing their best at this point to create at least a very soft landing for their children and their children's children.
Buying soccer clubs, for example.
Yes, buying soccer clubs and creating positions for some of them and things like this. But I think the numbers are certainly in their favor, and that from everything I know, from all the people that I've met in the country, I do genuinely believe that just having a different experience of life and of the world, a different formative experience than life in the Soviet Union, is going to make the next generation of leaders significantly different than the current ones.
Okay. I'm sorry, we had one last question.
Mr. Tucker, thank you for your speech. My name is Uzbek. I'm from Uzbekistan, Hubert Humphrey Fellow. Currently, I'm doing my internship with EPA office. So my question is related to energy crisis in Central Asia. How do you think, as you know, in late October previous year, Tajikistan launched the construction of Rogun Dam, and the estimate cost is $4 billion, and it will be the biggest dam in the world. And how do you think in future solving of this issue in Central Asia? So nobody discussing at this moment. And as you remember, our former president, Islam Karimov, was arguing that there may be water wars even if we can't manage this issue. So the biggest issue will be in next decades, transboundary water management issues in Central Asia. Thank you.
Well, this, again, is another question quite far outside of my own work and expertise. But, I mean, I can say, at least on the bilateral relations front, the Tajiks were thrilled by meetings with the new Mirziyoyev administration that happened in the fall, and while there wasn't a public full commitment from the side of Uzbekistan to say we're okay with this now, or a public endorsement of the Rogun project, their approach to it was very different than Karimov's, and there are many people. From or sources that we had in the Tajik government, that our Tajik service had in their own government, that said they felt like the meetings on this question specifically were extremely positive. So it seems like there's been some sort of private agreement made between the foreign offices to no longer stand in the way of this project. And as far as what kind of impact that'll have on water resources, I'd have to defer to others who study these things. But the other thing about Rogun, and I think part of the reason why it hasn't gotten more focus or more attention after construction began, is that construction is, as you mentioned, this is an incredibly expensive, ambitious project that is not fully funded yet. And so it remains a big question whether or not Tajikistan will be able to finish it. And so I almost wonder sometimes if the new Uzbek administration has decided just to sort of kick this can down the road for a while and enjoy good relationships and wait and see whether the dam construction continues at a steady pace.
Okay, I think we have put you through your paces long enough, Noah. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been really informative.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Can we all thank our guests, please?